silence. It's uncomfortable, isn't it? Like that awkward moment when you try to crack a joke. You're already smiling, and then you look around to notice that you're the only one smiling. In that moment, silence truly feels like emptiness. You look around, no reactions, no laughter, nothing. And I'm sure if I tried one of my jokes right now, I'm sure this crowd would demonstrate silence beautifully. But that's not the reason I started studying silence. I started studying silence because I noticed something strange. I realized something strange about words. We think silence means just the absence of sound. But the world has never been louder. And yet entire ideas, people, truths still disappear. So the silence I'm talking about isn't quiet. It's what happens when the world puts on noise-canceling headphones and decides what it will hear and what it will filter out. Because silence isn't random. It's structured, it's designed, it's engineered. Not engineered like a villain in a dark room pulling levers and strings. Honestly, that'd be much easier to deal with if you ask me. Because at least we know who to argue with. This kind of silence is invisible. It's woven into the way our systems function. And this system quietly but politely decides what gets heard and what quietly fades away into the background. Now, take indigenous knowledge, for example. Indigenous communities. Essentially, they were our world's first climate scientists. They could read wind patterns, predict monsoons, maintain biodiversity, understand soil behavior. And all of this without a single piece of modern technology as we know. No satellites, no drones, no spreadsheets. Yet, for centuries, their insights were treated as superstition and ignored. Until the very same insights were then rediscovered, repackaged, and published in academic journals with long titles and equations that frankly look like somebody fell asleep on a keyboard. Well, they weren't silent. We just built our institutions to now receive them. Now, if you want to see how this kind of silence operates on the modern world, you don't need to look back centuries, read history books or archives. In the early 2000s, a young Stanford dropout by the name of Elizabeth Holmes promised the world something extraordinary. One single drop of blood, hundreds of tests. It was faster, it was cheaper, it was revolutionary. Theranos. Theranos started as just an idea. Then it evolved into a startup. Then it became a sensation. Theranos partnered up with Walgreens, placing testing centers in pharmacies all across the United States. It partnered up with Safeway. It attracted funding from the US military, and it raised up to $700 million from its investors. And at its peak, was valued to be $9 billion. Imagine that, people. Elizabeth Holmes was on the cover of all the magazines you can imagine. Forbes, Time, Fortune, you name it. Elizabeth Holmes was being compared to Steve Jobs, and she spoke about changing the world. But there was one tiny problem. The technology didn't work. In the company, scientists knew, engineers knew, doctors raised concerns, tests failed, machines produced unreliable results. But no one ever spoke up. Why is that? Well, because silence wasn't just enforced by fear. It was reinforced by structure. Employees were isolated. Teams were separated. Information was compartmentalized. Non-disclosure agreements were aggressive. Questioning seemed like disloyalty, and doubt was framed as incompetence. Speaking up didn't feel brave. It felt career-ending. Now, if you want to see how this kind of silence operates in the modern world, in the digital world rather, silence in today's age does not need censorship. It doesn't need intentions. It doesn't need threats. It doesn't even need humans. It just needs algorithms. Algorithms don't care about the truth. They just care about engagement. Shock, fear, surprise, outrage. And here's the important nuance. When false information spreads, it's not because people knowingly spread lies. Of course, you wouldn't do that. It's because at first encounter, false news seems new, unique, and emotionally powerful. And that matters. In 2018, an MIT study analyzed over 126,000 Twitter stories and found that false news stories are 70% more likely to be retweeted than true news, true information. That's overall 6 times faster. Because false information is engineered to trigger stronger emotional responses. They trick your brain into thinking you've discovered something unique, something urgent, something exclusive. They activate your brain's reward system. Truth, on the contrary, is calm, it's balanced. It doesn't shout or scream, it explains. So, in a world that is optimized for speed and stimulation, truth doesn't just get silenced. It gets drowned, it gets overpowered. And this kind of silence doesn't just remain in institutions or online platforms. It slowly creeps up into our classrooms. Let me tell you a story. I remember being in 6th grade math class. My teacher called me up to the front of the board to solve a question. I knew the method, I knew the concept, but I just wasn't quite sure of the last step. So I stood frozen like this in front of the board, thinking, inside my brain I was going, what do I do, what do I do? But another student at the back of the class raised his hand, confident, immediate. He was called up instead. His answer wasn't perfect, but it was confident, and that was all that mattered. I went back to my seat, the question still forming in my head, and I'm not knowing how to solve it, but I wanted to ask my doubt to the teacher. But I didn't ask it. You know why? Not because I didn't care, but because hesitation had just been labeled as weakness. And now looking back on that fact, many years later, I realized that silence isn't always imposed. Sometimes silence is taught. Every time, speed beats thinking, confidence beats clarity, and performance beats understanding. And once you start noticing it, you start seeing it everywhere, like a watermark behind a picture. Subtle, persistent, and impossible to unsee. So maybe breaking the silence is not about shouting louder. What about listening or redesigning the way our systems function to listen better? Imagine a world where reception matters as much as expression, where classrooms allow thinking to breathe in before answers rush in. Imagine a world where institutions start rewarding honesty over hype, where questioning seems like responsibility, not resistance. A world where algorithms stop amplifying the heat and really stop preserving the meaning. Because, my friends, when reception improves, silence truly loses its grip. So here's the challenge I want to leave you guys with before I go. The next time something dominates your feed, your conversation, your attention, pause. Not just to think about what's being said, but rather to notice what isn't. To think about what isn't being said, what voices weren't invited, what questions felt inconvenient, what truths never entered the room. Because progress has never belonged to those who shout the loudest. It has always belonged to those who are willing to listen, especially where silence lives. Thank you, everybody.